All right, well, thanks everyone for being here. And again, this week is a week of just check-in and question and answer as much as anything. I have a few topics to touch on quickly and then want to make sure that we get any questions answered that today. Like I said, I just added into the chat 3 links to online college fairs that are happening this week. So the first one relates to colleges that change lives, which if you were on last week, you know that that was the topic of our call last week. And the fair starts today. It goes through several days. The coalition, that one I believe starts tomorrow. And the other, here, actually, let me just double check the dates so I can tell you accurately. The coalition one actually starts on the 28th. It is only one day. And then the Cialfo, I'm not sure how to pronounce that exactly, is May 29th and 30th. And they have keynote addresses and colleges. So theirs is divided up a little bit differently than some of the others are. But those are good resources for those of you continuing to do college research and trying to figure out ultimately what the college list is going to look like at this point. Again, maybe not ideal, not what we would normally be doing this time of year, but it is certainly helpful. I have some other information on a couple of others that I'll try to pop into here as well. Not so much fairs. One is an information session. It is a group of colleges that have traveled together for years. Georgetown, Brown, I can't think of all, they're highly selective, pretty much a group like that usually comes to Charlotte and does a live and answer information session, but they're doing that virtually this year, and I'll put the link in for that as well. And then there is a UK universities one that's happening soon too. I've emailed a couple of people directly about that who have expressed interest in, or their students have expressed interest in perhaps studying overseas, but I will pop those in here as well too. So let's get started. Sandy, you've already asked a great question in the chat about SAT registration. So I don't know that today necessarily is the opening day. It is the day, this is the week the registration for the SAT is supposed to reopen or to open for starting August test registration. I don't know if there have been technical issues. You are not the first person to report to me today that it has been problematic getting online. So my best advice, unfortunately, is just to keep trying. I think that just my experience with AP exams over the past 2 weeks is that technology sometimes, even for the most well-resourced companies in the world, doesn't always go well. So, but keep checking. It is supposed to open this week. It is supposed to be priority given to students who have not taken an SAT at all, or the class of 2021, just because they're going to need those tests earlier than our younger students who might sometimes still be trying to test in August and the fall in general. So be on the lookout for that, but keep trying if you've still, it also could just be jammed. I suspect that a lot of
go ahead. It's a Kim Stodgill virtual Zoom call. She's sending out links to a couple of other
that we don't
college fairs. One is tomorrow.
So that's a great question, though. Also, this week is supposed to be, you'll be getting a message. I don't know if any of you had students registered for the June ACT, but this week is the time the message will come out about whether or not registration, whether or not test centers are open. So that is dependent upon the individual test center. So you may not know that, or I guess they have to decide is the bottom line. It's individual. So they had to have made a decision already. You will get individual emails then if your child was registered for that and to know if it's happening or not. Here in Charlotte, I doubt that it is. It's probably very dependent on other parts of the country where you are. So ACT, look for that coming out if you had somebody registered for a June test for that. Their next test dates for the ACT are September and October. So that is, sorry, I'm muting everybody so that we can, that way drown out the background noise. I think that I got it that time. Thank you. Then what's Terry's question? So there's SAT out there available. So it is, Terry, are you asking if there is an SAT to register for? Is that your question? Can you give me a yes or yes? Okay. So yes, as of today, supposedly the registration will be open to register for the August and other fall test dates. Well, August specifically, not the other fall test dates that will roll out more slowly. So that is just the first issue has been people haven't been able to get online, or the registration hasn't been successful today. I'm not clear if that's just because this was the week we were supposed to get the notification, or if this was literally the day it was supposed to open. But it could be that there is just a technical problem. That's one of the things I was touching on probably just before you hopped on the call. But back to the ACT. So what we know for sure about the ACT is that they plan to offer September and October test dates as scheduled in the fall. Starting this fall as well, two things are happening with the ACT. The first is that you will be able to take an at-home test. So they're already advertising that, saying that that's going to be an option, seemingly regardless of what happens with schools in the fall. The SAT has said they're not going to roll out an at-home test until they know for sure if schools are open or not. Given that it may be different across the country, I don't know what they'll do. I suppose if you're in an area where you don't get to go back to physical school in the fall, you will get the opportunity to take an online test. But that is ACT saying it for sure. SAT is still holding out to see what happens with schools opening in the fall. The other important thing about the ACT, I think I've mentioned it before, but just if you don't know, or I need to reiterate, this fall, they are starting their section retesting plan, which means students who have taken a full ACT, which many of ours have because we got to get it into school before we were shut down. But if you've taken a full ACT and you have a section or two that you would like to try to retest to improve your score. So for example, if your math and science score needs some work, you can literally register just to go back in and take the math and science or one of those sections to try to improve, to have it added to your super score, which would then be rolled into whatever good section scores you already had that you didn't want to change. So that is beginning with the September test. There have been so far no plans to change that rollout. That was announced a year ago as they were headed into this before we had coronavirus. But again, I don't think that is going to change. I think they will just modify the options of being able to do that also from home if that's the case. That also means that more and more, in fact, schools in general, not more and more, schools are going to be super scoring the ACT because there are now these options to add in single section testing. And so that is something that has not universally been true, at least with the ACT. It's not always been a super scored test. It varied from college to college and what their own approach was to dealing with that each time. So that'll be a change. So again, ACT will let you know this week if you were registered for a June 13th test, if it's happening or not. So far from what I know in Charlotte, it is not happening, but you'll need to wait and get that official word from them. Any other questions about testing before we go on? That's all of that on that topic for right now, at least. If anybody has anything, you can put it in the chat, or feel free to unmute if you just want to ask a question. That's perfectly fine too. Christine is asking the deal with California schools. So in the continued news of schools doing away with the test score requirements for admission and things like that, that may be part of what you're referring to. So it's a big deal when the University of California system does it. Because for years we've the SAT has sort of gone with the whims of what the University of California system has wanted to do, and the Cal State system. Back in the days when we went from not having the writing test to having it started out, it did, not having a writing test, then we added the writing test, then we took it away again, now it came back. A lot of that had to do with what California was saying they wanted to do in terms of test scores. So it's very interesting that they have dictated a lot of SAT decisions over the years. now with them going away from requiring testing, I think SAT and College Board are scrambling in terms of wondering what's even going to be their bread and butter in the years to come. But that's just in line with what so many schools are doing right now. Literally every day, I'm still seeing a new email of a different school announcing that they are going to be test optional for at least this fall, some of them permanently. And so that's just really a shift that this situation has brought on, and it'll be very interesting to see those who say it's just for this year if it continues, but plenty are saying already that they're doing away with testing as a requirement going forward in terms of that. So that is going to be a huge shift in terms of that. Remember that on my website, I'm keeping an up-to-date list of resources, including the schools that are announced that they are going test optional for the fall or permanently, so you can access that information there. There's a new link to, relatively new link to college opening plans as well. So while I still think a lot of this is in flux, even despite the announcements that schools have been making, it's there and it should be updated by the website that you're just linking it to. So hopefully that will continue to change and evolve so that you can be updated about what is even happening in the fall, particularly as you're making plans perhaps to visit and things like that. So those are the kinds of things that are evolving as we go. So with regard to, let's see, good question about CMS tests or CMS grading. I wish I had a definitive answer for this. I agree. You said you've read it a couple of times. You're still not sure you understand it. I also feel the same way. I have read various versions as well of what is actually happening with CMS grading. I've asked questions directly of people who work in CMS and still don't feel like I have a solid answer for you all about that. It is my goal was to try to have a solid update today, but when I got really conflicting answers from two people that I asked, I didn't really know what to do with that information. So if you'll recall, I had the call a few weeks ago where we talked about that topic. Right after that, literally within 24 hours, there was an update then that made it, to me, read that if you were, whatever was higher, your score from first semester or your grade, not your score, your grade from first semester, or your grade from third quarter, you could choose to take whatever was your higher grade. So your first semester grade, if it was a 90 something and you had an 89 at the end of third quarter, or when we went on to remote learning, that you would be able to choose to use that higher semester grade in the calculation. Then I saw another message just last week that was confusing and didn't seem to say that same thing. So that's when I started asking questions again. So unfortunately, that is something I don't have 100% clarity on. So I am still working on that, even if it's not presented in this format on this call next week. As soon as I have something a little bit more definitive, I will share that. Today I asked a similar question of yet another person and just got the answer that between June 1st and June 9th is when students will choose what grades they want to use. So I followed up, but didn't hear back again in time before we got on the call this morning, but I followed up to say, well, what does that even mean? What are they choosing? What are their choices, so that we know how to best decide what to do at that point. But that's all I know right now. Again, sorry that I don't have a definitive answer about that. It seems very nebulous and I don't know why we can't come to an agreement about exactly what's happening with the grades just yet. But I did get one definitive piece of information. I won't say definitive, because as soon as I do, there'll be a new communication from CMS that something has changed. But it's the plan is that the last day of classes, if you will, at least in terms of new work being assigned, is going to be this Friday, May 29th. And then from there, that's where that June 1st through June 9th date came into the conversation I was having about students choosing their grades at that point, and also continuing to finish up any work that was outstanding, either from any time really, I guess, in the third or fourth quarter, but specifically if they're still working on work that has been assigned, they can do that in that time period. But no new work should be assigned according to this was Allison Davis actually this morning at Myers Park, no more should be assigned after Friday. So, I hope that is, again, accurate. It's very confusing to kind of keep up with all of this when it doesn't seem like we have clear information. So, and then Christina, yes, I think you're right. You understand that for Myers Park IB students only, they have until the 9th to finish IB projects in Lit and HODA. Yes, I do. I've read that information as well. So I believe that to be true too. So again, still time to work on finishing up longer, bigger projects and things like that for IB students in those following few days. Anybody else have any insights or any other questions about CMS? Maybe even as parents, you all have read or heard other things if you've had communications with anyone. Anything for the good of the group. But again, I will keep looking for a clear answer about that in terms of the grading scale and grading choices in particular, not the grading scales. That's not changing. The grading choices in terms of what students are actually choosing from as we go forward. Oh, back to an SAT question, Terry, that's a great question. The question is, can you take an SAT out of state? And absolutely you can. If you can find an open test center in an area where you're going to be at some point, you can absolutely sign up and take it there. I've had, especially athletes, do that a lot of times during the school year. If they're traveling and they're going to be gone on a Saturday somewhere, they'll do that in a different town somewhere. So that's a great question. Yeah, it doesn't matter where you take it, as long as you have the scores and you report your own high school as the high school that you attend, and then you make sure well, you're not sending your scores until later, but that you have your scores to send. So that's a great question. All right, let's see. A couple of other things, just topics in general for juniors. Let's start with them. Things for juniors to be thinking about. Many of you I've talked to individually, but just to recap, be sure you're working on getting your resume or list of activities together so that that is nicely organized and ready to go in terms of having it for not only putting it in the common application, but just having something started like that so that it can be more developed as time goes on, and you can work on a living, breathing sort of resume document that can get your students started even into high school so that they have something to use for things like, I mean, it's even for sorority and fraternity recruitment sometimes, but even internships and other things like that. It will at least get them started until something more professional gets developed as they go through college. It's definitely time to be reaching out to teachers. There are already, I know a couple of teachers at Myers Park who are saying that they are full for writing recommendations. So again, if you or your student hasn't done that already, be sure that you've thought about teachers to ask and are sending emails and asking questions about their sort of policy or their plan or what information they need to use to write a good recommendation for you. And you want to be sure that you're getting on those lists so that teachers can do that. Also important to touch base with your school counselor. Many schools in CMS, at least I know, are just offering appointments. You just go online and book a 10 or 15 minute appointment to check in. The reason this is important is, one, they're going to ultimately write you a letter of recommendation. And so you'd like to have a contact point with them just to sort of check in with them about your college process, let them know what you're thinking in terms of where you plan to apply, and ask them what other information do they need from you at this point, if anything. And that way you're just kind of making sure you're staying in the loop about what school might need specifically. And then they have, again, put a name and a face together, especially if you don't see your counselor very often, or you just, again, want to make sure that they know who you are and that you're thinking about where you're planning to apply, that you're on top of things, and you want to make sure you're getting done whatever they ask of you. Typically over the summer, they will ask you to, in Naviance, fill out your list of colleges if you're a rising senior, where you're planning to apply, so that they know ultimately where you're going to be there. They are going to be sending your transcripts and teacher recommendations. So that helps keep them organized as well. So you definitely want to make sure students are doing that when it's time, so that, because this high school has to be the one to send those documents, we have to be sure that they know your deadlines and your locations to where those things need to be sent. So that's important. Sophomores, and even well, sophomores in particular, it's not too early for you all to actually start or have your students start on a resume as well. Just starting to even get down on paper a list of the activities that they've been involved in, dates of those involvements, those kinds of things, because again, it will just save the step of kind of putting it all together at one time next year when it's closer to actually having to do the application. So that's something that, you know, a good brainstorm. Parents are often really good at remembering what students have done and encouraging them to put that down on the list. Students will sell themselves short and say, well, that's not important, when at this point everything is, and we can decide later when it's time to fill out an application if there's something that needs to be culled from the list at that point. But for now, get it all down on paper as a brainstorm, and again, continue to keep up with that as we go along. And then for sophomores, and well, really everybody, but sophomores and freshmen, I'm going to be sending out individual emails to you all as a class soon. But one of the things, while there's not a lot to do as preparing for college right now, one of the things I encourage you to do is just sort of reflect on the year. This year in particular has a lot of opportunity for reflection in terms of how it's gone and how maybe you were impacted by online learning or things like that. In a normal year, what I say is I'd like for you just to tell me, you know, write down things that went well for you, things that didn't go as well, favorite class, maybe even favorite teacher, favorite activity, those kinds of things. Just so, again, it's all part of just building up a resource and information that will help you either think of things to answer questions down the road when you're filling out applications, or in terms of just reflecting on, if this didn't go so well this year in a particular class or in a particular subject, what might I need to do differently to make that better for future years in terms of being successful in school and those kinds of things. Juniors, you will be asked a question specifically on your applications this year, on the Common App at least, about your experience with learning in these circumstances. And so parents and students that are that age, it is also important to be reflecting on that. You don't have to write a formal essay right now, but just, you know, again, sometimes it's good to be talking it out at home a little bit so that students are ready when it's time to answer that question on an application, and they've thought through some of that in terms of what their impact would be and how they would describe that in that part of the application. So those are kind of my topics for today. It's really a quick check-in, other than the news that Aunt Becky, Lori Laughlin, is going to spend time for for getting her kids into school by paying a lot of money to do so. There hasn't been any earth-shattering changes this week in the world of college admissions. Again, keeping up to date by checking online about what are schools' plans for opening in the fall, what are schools' plans in terms of testing and using that in the application process. Next week, my topic is going to be how you present yourself in an application, and I'm working on still getting together my panel of experts to talk about just really what you say matters, what you say in an essay, what you write on your resume, the activities section of an application, even potentially what do interviews say about you, or how are they used in various interview or admissions processes. So I'm pulling that together still. Time is apparently 11 a.m. on Tuesdays is a big time for people to have staff meetings. So there may be a slight adjustment in our time, because I have one friend in particular who's she's just really articulate about how she describes what she wants to hear from students in essays. And I just really would love to have her, but trying to work with her schedule. So be on the lookout. I will make sure it's very clear if the time adjusts for next week, but I think that's a really important topic. No matter what age your student is at this point, just because that doesn't change typically. But for this year's class, if you're applying test optional, if that's the decision you make, or if we just see that change where more and more schools are going test optional and that's the route you decide to take, how do you then maximize the positive? What else are you saying about yourself elsewhere in the application that will help you stand out in terms of that? So that's my plan for that. But I'd love to hear from you all. If there are other topics that you would like to talk about. I know I got an email last week after this session about potentially doing something for athletes. And again, certain topics will obviously be very specific and will result in perhaps a smaller group here and there, but I'm happy to do that because I think there are some perhaps special interest groups that we could address. If there are just other topics in general that you haven't heard that you'd like me to cover, or if we want to just recircle and have some folks from admissions in general. Just again, it's been over a month since, well, it's been longer than that. The days have run together, however many days we've been home, since I had my first group of just the experts talking about admissions in general. And I'm happy to go back and have a different group of folks just come on and talk about those kinds of things. So feel free to put that in the chat to me or to everyone, or also if you have, if you'd rather just email me after this is over, if you want to think on it, I'm happy to do that. I love the ideas. I love to get folks involved in the conversations as well. So let me go through a couple of there are some questions here in the chat as you all are thinking on what else, other topics you might want to include, but let's see. It's still true that many college freshmen. So this question is about, is it still true that many college freshmen, so getting ready to go to college, graduating seniors from high school, are deferring college and taking a gap year? I heard that many schools are tightening up deferral rules. My worry is how all these deferrals will affect the class of 2021. So it is true that, well, it's true according to the Gap Year Association that their inquiries about taking a gap year have increased dramatically. It is also true that colleges are being conservative with saying yes to all of these deferrals, because as you can imagine, if they say yes to everyone and they don't have a class and they don't make any money in the fall, that's going to be even more detrimental than the situation they've been in. They can't continue to lose money off of tuition and room and board and things like that. So what I have gathered and read and listened to on a few different webinars is that colleges are not being more generous. They're actually, if anything, being more conservative with who they are saying yes to. You cannot just call your college as if you're a graduating high school senior and say, well, I've decided I'm not coming if we're doing online classes. That isn't going to be a reason that they would necessarily grant you a deferral. If you have a legitimate plan and you've put something together and you call them and petition them, you don't necessarily call, it's an email usually, put together your plan and you say, this is what I would do with my gap year, then you share that information and if you have a plan, you have a much higher likelihood of being granted a deferral. But the catch with that is there are a lot of students out there who are floundering, who don't really have a plan. They just know they don't really want to do online school in the fall. And so it's sort of this, spiral effect of you've got to have the plan, you have to have something legitimate to do, even if that is, you say you're going to take online classes and learn to cook. I don't know, there are lots of ways you can spend a gap year, but it's a matter of, again, having a really solid plan and not just having an aversion to doing online school. So of course the worry is always about how is that going to impact current juniors, rising seniors, class of 2021. What will the trickle down effect be? And there will be some. I mean, we're not going to, I think we'd be naive to say that there's not going to be any impact on this class whatsoever. But here are some other factors that we still don't know the answers to. We still don't know what's going to happen to international student admission, even in this current fall semester, and maybe even a trickle down effect for a few more years. If they're not comfortable traveling or coming to the States from overseas, families may not want to send their students that far. What if we go back into something like this and it's hard to get home? And what is our country going to do in terms of granting those visas and things like that, which is still a little bit up in the air in a lot of cases. There is still, what did I read? And the other day was interesting. So the other part of it is when you're a college and you're trying to manage your numbers of who's on campus at what time, because you can only fill so many seats in so many spaces, even in a normal environment when everybody's packed in together, you're still also having to account for your usual number of students that travel abroad and go overseas to study and things like that. So for this coming year, colleges are predicting that their study abroad programs are not going to be fully open and functioning. So all those students will have to stay on campus this year, even if they had planned to go somewhere. Then they may opt to take off that year after, which again, then opens up more spots, which again, are spots that help our class of 2021 in terms of the enrollment. It's a very complicated rubric that all goes into how they determine all of this. It's why they're enrollment managers, and I don't understand all of the data that they look at, but it does sound like there are still so many variables that, while there is some impact probably going to be felt by the class of 2021, I don't think at every college they A, even know what it is, and B, it's not all necessarily going to be negative. I mean, there's also been this big rumor about that it may be easier to get into certain colleges because, again, international students aren't coming, people are staying closer to home after all of this in general, making different choices financially. So there's so many different pieces of this that it's just one of those that I don't think we have any real answers about right now, because I don't even think colleges know how their numbers are going to be impacted as we go forward. So I think once we know what's happening with schools in the fall in terms of opening plans and things like that, and we see what enrollment numbers look like, then we can have a little bit more of a conversation about what that it means for the class of 2021, at least with what data we will have at that point. So quickly, yes, another question about the ACT. Is it going forward in June and July? So I did mention this earlier, but it is June. They are letting you know this week. If you were registered for the test, you will hear from your test center about whether or not it's happening. My impression is that in Charlotte, it is not happening, but you will get an email from the ACT to let you know about that. Nothing else beyond that has been definitively said for the ACT in terms of that. Let's see. Mostly then just some other ideas about things to share. Will there be? Okay, so this question is, will there be 2 essay questions to answer on the Common App, or is the one about COVID a choice? I think what you're saying then is that a choice out of the topics? No, it will be a separate question. So the topics for the Common App essay will be the same topics that they were last year. They haven't changed. Those topics are going to be, those are set. Those are already what students have been thinking about, could be working on if they want to. The COVID question will be an additional optional question to respond to. So again, optional, usually I say optional means required, or that you should at least do it. I think with each student, it depends a lot on what the answer would actually be. I think colleges want to hear they don't necessarily want to hear that I just hated staying home and online learning was awful. So thinking about what exactly, how a student would portray that in their answer is important when we think about what they're going to say. And then, let's see. Well, next year, the kids. So another question about testing, will next year's kids that have strong test scores be at a disadvantage when applying to college? And the answer that I've gotten from college folks when I've asked that is absolutely not. It is test optional, not test blind. So if a student has really strong test scores, they should absolutely still submit those test scores, and those will be considered in the process. And so that is, a lot of kids already worked hard on that, and colleges understand that. And so all they're doing is trying to sort of open up the opportunities for those who either, like, again, here in North Carolina, we test in school for the ACT. So that's something that many of our students were able to do on that particular day and at least have a test score. Maybe not their favorite, but at least they have a test score. So again, colleges are just trying to accommodate the vast majority of kids who either didn't have, I shouldn't say it's a vast majority, but the kids who did not have any type of score at all, or again, even our students who maybe only got to test once, maybe twice this year, and aren't as thrilled with their scores because the progression and the time they had to work on that didn't necessarily happen the way it normally would. But absolutely, if the scores are strong, they should still be submitted, because those will still be used for colleges in those processes. So that's a great question. Let's see. So this question is attending a summer pre-college program, even virtually right now, at a prestigious university a good idea for college admission? I've read that it can actually be detrimental as it sends a message that a student specifically is interested in that college that they went to the summer program, and thus, while not increasing admission chances at that school, could also decrease chances at other schools. So I've never heard it presented quite like that. I do agree that it does not increase your chances of admission at a specific school to do a summer program at that specific school. And I do agree that, it could be seen as, oh, that your student had an interest in that particular place because that's where they spent their summer trying to get that experience. But my counterpoint to that would also be that there are some schools that offer summer programs in very specific topics, and journalism comes to mind immediately just because I know how hard it can be to find a journalism program. And there are summer programs at this small handful of universities, but you can major in journalism at so many different other places. So the fact that, I send a student to NYU to do journalism for the summer, while sure, they may have an interest in NYU, but I don't know that a school elsewhere would then say that counts against them in their admission process because it was just an example of a place that they could do their summer program. In this year's climate, especially with the virtual options, I would say that you just have to take advantage of whatever is available to you, because that is how you can get the exposure in certain topics in certain areas. And I'd have to ask, I'll do some follow-up digging on that question because I've never been asked it just like that, but I don't believe that a college that you applied to that was not the college you did the summer program in would hold that against you specifically in the process. What about college stability with current economic situation? I've heard tier 1 and 2 are better than tier 3, but I don't know what a tier 3 is. What can we look at to help us with this? That's a great question. It is, the schools that are going to struggle the most are primarily small liberal arts colleges and then smaller regional universities that are part of a big university system. So I have read this some about, so some Midwestern states, for example, Pennsylvania is a great example. So Penn State, we all know the main Penn State campus is going to be fine. They're thousands and thousands of students. They get the most funding from the state, but they have all of these satellite campuses around their state, some of which are very small, and that where a lot of times those satellite campuses are located in smaller, more rural communities anyway, and they just are not going to necessarily have a college going population right now as strongly as they might have before this, because again, economics are impacting the people who would even be paying to go to college. Small liberal arts colleges, there were several already on the verge. I mean, we're talking very small places with enrollments of like 800 to 700 students. 3 schools in Vermont, for example, closed already. They were on the verge well before coronavirus came onto the scene. So those are the kinds of places that you're talking about. I will send you directly a link about that in terms of where you can get some information about that. Most schools, though, are finding ways to stay viable depending on their endowments and things like that, but they have to be careful about that. You have an endowment, and a lot of times the money in that endowment is specific for certain types of resources and other things not covered by coronavirus. And so some schools are really struggling with the fact that they have money sitting there that they can't actually access because it is set aside for something else so specific that it can't just be dipped into to even save them in these kinds of crises. But I have seen on my listserv a couple of different emails about sort of researching that type of information. So I'll be sure and follow up with you directly about that. So this, in terms of looking at a current college list, so if you're a junior and you've got a college list going, so that's what we're talking about here. Some schools that were typically reach schools might become more target schools, or vice versa, because looking at historic recent test scores, so the data from admissions on test scores, that's what we obviously have to go on, is what has already happened up to this point. That's how we've always judged if something's a reach or a target or a likely in your college list. But this year, test scores might be just lower overall, since some students, again, we haven't had the longevity of testing and things like that, or as we normally do. So how do we compare students' current SAT against last year's averages, when we don't know exactly what this year's group is going to look like? The bottom line on that is that can happen even in a normal year. There have been times when certain changes to tests have been made that have really kind of shifted the overall testing averages and things like that. What colleges will typically do, I'm not answering your specific question yet about how it helps us compare your students' current scores versus admissions. So I'll try to get to that in a second. But in general, what colleges are going to do with that information is they're going to aggregate what they're getting in and start to see, first of all, what is that sort of average looking like for them. Now, that only happens in snapshot form because they're gathering information as it comes in. So if the deadline is November 1st, they're going to have several test scores, hundreds of test scores even prior to that. So they may take a look on October 15th and try to get a read on that. And then when they start reading files, do it again a couple of weeks into the process, but they're going to try to keep it within what they're seeing in their own pool, at least in terms of averages and things like that, as one measure. It's not the end all be all, but that's one thing that they will do. Because again, if typically a high test score is a 1350, for example, but all of a sudden they're realizing their kids are not applicants this year, are not getting to that number, that doesn't mean they're not going to admit anybody. They're going to have to adjust. So that's a little harder then to target, because we just don't know what the comparison number is going to be this year. So we still have to go with looking at history as much as possible. Because, well, that's just for us, from outsiders looking in, the data, the old information that we have is really all we have to go on until there is a new batch of test scores to report for this year's class when they apply. So I think it is still the best plan is always going to be to think of schools in their highest particular category. So a reach, a target, et cetera. You want to still consider them in those historic, where we would put them, categories, because you don't want to assume that something is going to be easier and then find out that it's not. We'd rather be surprised that it is by finding out that a student is admitted than assuming that it's going to be easier and then be disappointed with the information or the decision on the other side of that. So that's not a definitive answer, but it's just very hard to do any kind of comparison with just numbers that we are imagining out there, because we don't have hard data to go for or to look at that. Let's see. And then summer, just in general, a quick note about summer is, what are things that students can be doing. Again, another resource on my website is a list of virtual summer programs. I know that's not exactly ideal. It's not the same as getting onto a campus, or just even onto into a bank and doing an internship, or shadowing a doctor, or doing some of these cool things that I know students had planned to do this coming summer. But there are ways to keep people busy, our students busy, trying to keep them active and engaged in something that could help still set them apart down the road for having tackled something over the summer, in terms of trying something new, or just checking out an online offering of some sort in terms of that. Again, not ideal, but there are lots of options out there. And I think, especially on college campuses, they're working hard to make those things happen, because they're still looking to engage students. It's a marketing tool for them. It's, in a normal year, they want students to be on their campus. That's part of how they sell all of their amenities and things like that as they go along too. So, but those are things just to be thinking about. But also, I think it's important that we remember as parents too, that if it's not exactly the summer any of us imagined, it's not going to be the end of the world. And I know believe me, if you read my blog this week, did not enjoy online learning at home. I was not the best parent I could have been through all of that. I was more of a nag than I ever am, and which goes against actually my philosophy as an educator. So I don't know what happened to me. Somebody else took over and was controlling my thoughts and my actions to online learning here in my house. But I really have to step back and remember that we're all in this same situation. Everybody's sort of resumes and transcripts are going to have these blips in terms of things that have changed and things that were impacted. And as parents, we have to do our best to keep our kids just positive, as thinking about, okay, this is not the end of the world. It may feel like it at times because you're a teenager and your life is not exactly the way you would like it to be right now, but there are still some ways we can try to keep them engaged. And so happy to talk about summer ideas and things like that to do that. So that's the end of the questions in the queue. If nobody has anything else, I would still love to hear other thoughts and ideas. I got a couple. Thank you for other ideas that we might do in terms of topics, and I'll look into some of that. I have been keeping my list of notes of who I need to follow up with directly to answer some of those other questions and to try to make sure we get some clarification about CMS, preferably sooner rather than later. I will, if I can get an answer on their grading plans before the end of the week, I'll just send it in an email when I send out the replay of this video today. So that will be included in that. Again, you can always reach out to me directly if you have follow-up questions or just ideas that you want to share as topics you'd like to hear about. Check out the list of the 3 different online college fairs that are happening this week. I will link the information about the UK information session and the other one that's called the Coast to Coast. It's not a fair, but it's a session in terms of the 6 colleges that travel together that is going virtual instead of coming directly to Charlotte this spring. And I will keep all of that going and keep updating it as time goes by. Stay tuned for me if I adjust the time for next week. I think next week's topic is a really exciting one to just talk about how to best be presented in the application. And so if I have to adjust to accommodate my dear friend's schedule, I may do that, and I will let you all know. Obviously, the recording will always be available to follow up with if the time doesn't work for you. But if there aren't any other questions today, then we'll sign off, and I will look forward to seeing you all back here soon. All right. Thank you all. Take care.